Buonasera. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here today, to students and colleagues and friends and family and Kim Cassidy. I don't know where she is, but there she is, former president of Bryn College. Kim, we are so excited to have you here back with us. And a special thank you, of course, to Edwina Patruno, Nicholas Patruno wife, when I invited her, I think a couple of months ago, I asked her to please come today for this special event, and Edwina obviously asked me why, what's going on, and I answered her, I cannot reply, it's a surprise, but please come. So Edwina, this book is my surprise for you, and I'm looking forward to give you a copy later. This roundtable celebrates the publication of this book, which just came out, co-edited by myself and Chiara Benetollo, here with us. It is a monographic peer-reviewed issue of the journal Northeast Modern Language Association Italian Studies, so-called NIS. It is the continuation and expansion of the successful symposium held at Bryn College on April 22nd, 2022, which was titled after Patruno's monograph, Understanding Primo Levi. But it is not only that. It opens up to authors whose scholarly expertise on Primo Levi enriches this volume with a variety of thematic and historical cross-references, with the intent to offer a collection on Primo Levi that best represents the critical analysis of the 20th century as a privileged space for the elaboration on post-World War II. This gaze, always oriented by literary historical perspective of those years, guides the depth and the range of the essays here published. Chiara and I have every expectation that it will produce a fruitful conversation that will grow in the years to come, interrogating the cross-disciplinary and cross-cultural scholarship of salient and intertwined aspects of Levi's literature. Primo Levi, a Jewish Italian chemist from the city of Torino in northern Italy, continues to be widely read both in the Italian and American academia. Although he is known primarily for his contributions to Holocaust testimony with Se questo uomo, La tregua, I sommersi salvati, Levi was also a columnist, literary critic, poet, essayist, translator, and writer of short stories and fantasy tales, many of which border on science fiction, such as The Periodic Table, considered his magnum opus. In his monograph, Understanding Primo Levi, published in 2008, Nicholas Patruno defined Levi as a writer, and here I quote, of encyclopedic vein, end of quote, and argued that Levi's significance as an artist and as a communicator is precisely this fusion of his scientific sensibilities and literary creativity. 35 years after his death, Levi's work continues to be theatrically adapted and performed, keeping his profound impact and legacy alive as one of the most widely read writers, thinkers, and cultural influencers of 20th century literature. This collection, which we title Primo Levi, Essays in Dialogue of Nicholas Patruno, points towards a profusion of pathways into a through Levi's writings by opening perspectives that are both historical and theoretical, archival and actual, cinematographic and textual. It is our hope that the essays collected here will ignite, re-energize the scholarly conversations and will constitute a starting point for new academic work, new intellectual debates, new classroom syllabi, not only to capture the perduring risk of fascism, anti-Semitism, and racism today, but also the power of Levi's creative vein and originality. The event today constitutes the final project of a senior seminar which I co-taught with Luca Zipoli on late Thursday evenings on modernism. Our wonderful students have organized entirely this event as the final project of the seminar, and they will lead the conversation with comments and questions to the panelists. They did an amazing job preparing all details, from the design of the flyer and the pamphlet to logistics and scholarship. And before giving the floor to them, I hope you can join me in thanking all the panelists, which will be introduced shortly by our students. Ma grazie mille a tutti di essere qui. And to our students, who are Eleanor Taylor, Lillian Belzer, Evangeline Welsh, Emily Short, and Corrie-Tannen. Thank you so much. And the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again so much for being here, and thank you to our panelists, who I'd just like to introduce briefly. Simona Wright is professor of Italian and director of the Italian program at the College of New Jersey, as well as the editor of NeMLA Italian Studies since 2006. Chiara Benetollo, one of the co-editors of this volume, is the executive director for the Puttkamer Center for Educational Justice and Equity, a research center on carcerality within the Petey Greene program. And Luca Zipoli, one of my professors, is professor of Italian here at Bryn Mawr College, as is Roberta Ricci. And then Peter Kurtz, pardon me, is a PhD student in comparative literature at the CUNY Graduate Center, an instructor at Hunter College. And last but not least, Scott Lerner is a professor at Franklyn and Marshall in the departments of French and Italian, comparative literature and Judaic studies. So thank you all so much again for being here. We're so excited to hear from you. And we wanted to start off with asking a question of you, Simona, if that's all right. As we mentioned, you're the editor of NeMLA Italian Studies, which is for the publication of this book. So we were just wondering if you could share with us sort of the origins and first steps of this book. When did this project start? How did it evolve over time? What does it mean for you to be the editor of NeMLA Italian Studies? What principles guide your choices for publications? And why was this project in particular a good fit for this journal?
I was given 5 minutes, so I don't pardon me. Well, thank you so much. And first of all, thank you for inviting me here. I am very pleased to be. Oh, really? Do I need this? So I'm very pleased to be here to celebrate this volume with Roberta Ricci and Chiara Benetollo. With Roberta, we have established a wonderful professional and personal relation for many years. In fact, we actually collaborated at the co-editing of the Renaissance, a book on the Renaissance, a volume on the Renaissance. So, okay, let me start with this. So, the origin and first steps of this book. So right after the COVID pandemic, Roberta contacted me and asked me if I was interested in publishing a volume of NeMLA Italian Studies with the idea of celebrating Patruno and Primo Levi. So we met very informally at her house, and I don't remember if it was 21 or 22, because I mean, generally the volumes take a long time to be published, but definitely I was interested in this cooperation. NeMLA Italian Studies is a publication that is open source, so it's not, it's under the umbrella of the NeMLA organization, and it is actually the first journal that supports any language in the larger organization. So NeMLA Italian Studies was founded 40 years ago, and in 2006 I took over from Professor Mariani. So the idea that I had in managing NeMLA Italian Studies is to give open access to scholars and to have access for everybody, so that they don't have, students of all kinds, students or audiences and readerships that are not necessarily academic can have access to scholarly work. So the idea, of course, of collaborating again with Roberta and Chiara, whom I met at our meeting, was exhilarating. To remember both Patruno and then to continue the work that is necessary for us on Primo Levi. So it was a fascinating project, and of course I knew that Roberta and Chiara were extremely professional, and I let them lead the project, and I know that also Luca Zipoli was going to be part of it. So clearly, if I have to think of a philosophical of the philosophical value, or the value of culture, the value of knowledge, for me, Primo Levi, as Roberta mentioned, is one of the fundamental figures, cultural figures, literary figures of the 20th century in Italy, but also for literature in general, for world literature. So for me, I felt very honored that Roberta thought of collaborating with NeMLA Italian Studies, and I gave her all my support. We had several passages because this is a peer-reviewed. It's a scholarly journal, so it needs to be up to par with the rest of the journals that we have in literary studies. So I was honored, and I thank Roberta and Chiara for this excellent work. Have I answered all the questions? Within a time limit? That's unusual. I think it's you.
Hello, everyone. I would like to echo Lucy's thank yous, of course, to the panelists and to everyone who came to listen. I am going to speak a bit about this first article, this first essay in the collection, which is Chiara Benetollo's essay entitled Free Also to Make Mistakes and Masters of One's Own Destiny, Primo Levi, the Anti-Alpinist. And this really offers a reading of how alpinism figures in two of Primo Levi's short stories, both as a practice and as a literary tradition with extensive storied ties to fascism. So, to understand the alpine backdrop of Levi's writings, Benetollo first examines the history of mountaineering in the alpine novel. Alpinism, Benetollo notes, has always been characterized by the coupled desires to conquer and to control the mountain environment. When the Alps became, quote, a testing ground for the competition between national states, end of quote, during the 19th century, this rhetoric was easily adaptable to Europe's growing fascist enterprise. Benetollo notes how these politics can be seen reflected in the Alpinist literary canon, both before and after the rise of fascism, with mountaineers like Edward Whymper, Albert Mummery, and Eugen Lerner, among others, writing autobiographical accounts of their, quote, search for danger as the ultimate test of human limits and the desire to dominate the natural environment through the control of one's body. So,
What place does alpinism have in Primo Levi's writing? Benetollo turns to his 1984 interview with La Rivista della Montagna, in which Levi talks about his experience hiking as a teenager. In this interview, Levi, quote, interspersed the memory of his own adventures in the Alps with the fond memory of the text that informed and shaped these experiences. Building on his familiarity with the mountains and the literary and rhetorical traditions surrounding them, Levi repeatedly tried to write his own epic of mountaineering. Benetollo highlights, too, the instances wherein Levi repeatedly and directly references Whymper, Mummery, and Lerner, as well as an official Italian mountain club trail map in his writing. To make sense of this seemingly incongruous fascist presence looming throughout Levi's writing, Benetollo engages in close readings of two of his short stories. The first, Bear Meat, was written in 1961 and is, in Benetollo's words, a frame narrative with, quote, an autobiographical first-person narrator that recalls his encounter with two older alpinists who each told the story of the ill-advised, naive climbs of their youth, end of quote. The second, Iron, is one chapter of Levi's lauded 1975 book In Sistema Periodico, The Periodic Table. In this second story, Levi re-elaborates the narrative of Bear Meat, but this time without any narratorial mediation, identifying the protagonist as himself and Alessandra del Mastro, who is called simply Sandra. Through her close readings, Benetollo argues that Levi's engagement in the Alpine tradition is a realization of a new alpinist hero, one who is not defined by desires for conquest and control or by the idea of perfecting the human body. This new hero is similarly unmotivated by the superimposition of the Italian language and national presence onto the Alpine environment. Examining the character of Sandro in Iron and the dialect-speaking mountaineers in Bear Meat, Benetollo argues that Levi, quote, utilized topoi and images from the Alpine tradition as the building blocks for a new kind of mountaineering hero, who rejected all tools used to dominate the natural environment. And this brings me to a quote from the concluding paragraph of Benetollo's essay, which reads, quote, Sandro was not a man to talk about or to build monuments to, he who laughed at monuments. And this is from the periodic table. Yet precisely because he was a man of action, who was all in his actions, now that he is gone, there is nothing left of him, nothing except words. Levi was left with the impossible, yet utterly necessary task to clothe him in words, make him live again on the written page. End of quote. And this led me to think about how, in preserving the history of the Holocaust through autobiographical accounts, Levi was, by nature of the form he chose, also preserving his own lived experience on the written page, making himself live again. Gathered here to discuss writings on Levi's life and work years after his death, in a way, we are, too, engaging in this same tradition of memorialization. Thinking about Levi's reverence in these Alpine stories for people who lived through actions rather than through words, and who laughed at monuments, what do you, Chiara, understand to be Levi's own relationship with memorialization? How, if at all, do you think he reckoned with this narratorial presence that lives on after him?
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Thank you for the invite, Roberta and Luca, and thank you, Eleanor, for really just summarizing my article in a way that made me think, oh, wow, did I really write all of this? So, and what a question. Again, trying to say within 5 minutes, I think you touch on what is really a key aspect of Levi's writing, and more than his writing, really something that he struggled with and he dealt with for all of his life. That is this paradox of memory, of the memory of others, and of the memory of himself, right? He emerged in the Italian literary landscape as a writer very much tied to the memory of the concentration camps, and that was not enough for him, right? He did not want to be just someone who wrote about the concentration camps, and writing the La Tavola Periodica and all of the other things that he wrote that are outside of this genre are precisely an attempt to escape this framing, among many other things, but also an attempt to escape being framed as a writer that just works to memorialize things. But on the other hand, we also see that he constantly really struggles with not feeling listened enough, or feeling that those who did come back from the concentration camps are misunderstood, ignored, willfully or unwillingly, right? And the question of what words can we possibly use to describe the horror that we have witnessed is really a central question in Levi's work. And so in a way, of course, words are always insufficient. And words are insufficient to fight against fascism, and to make the anti-fascism live on. So for maybe what we have left are actions like those of Sandro. But then again, actions without words, they dissolve. We wouldn't know about Sandro Del Mastro and all of his anti-fascist activism if Levi hadn't memorialized it. So yes, to all of the above, this is very much a central theme in Levi's writing, and something that really doesn't have a clear resolution. It's a paradox that lives on, and that I think keeps challenging all of us as we think about it. How do we fight against again the ongoing fascism and racism and all of its manifestations that keep coming back today?
Thank you, Chiara. Hello, all. Thank you all again for coming here today. I'm here to discuss the article written by our very own Dr. Luca Zipoli, a long, thorough, and beautifully written article titled Writing After and About the Holocaust, Primo Levi and Umberto Saba. So Dr. Zipoli's article discusses 4 private letters written between 1948 and 1949, all of which were found in Torino, 2 of them by Dr. Zipoli himself, written between Umberto Saba and Primo Levi. These letters show discussions between these 2 pioneers of writing after the Holocaust, an idea in which he develops in this article. The 2 had differences in generation, Saba being the older of the 2, their educational backgrounds in sciences in Levi's case versus bookselling for Saba, their birthplace in Trieste or Torino, and Saba's status as a popular writer versus Levi's recent return from the concentration camps. Both were non-practicing Jews and suffered from related cultural and political trauma. However, Levi suffered from the specific experience of living in the lager, whereas Saba discusses more the general suffering of the time due to his Jewish identity and anti-Semitic laws and beliefs at the time. In these letters, the 2 discuss their works, If This Is a Man, and Shortcuts and Short Stories by Primo and Umberto, respectively. They also discussed, as their works do, life in the 20th century, specifically after the Holocaust, and how it changed after the Holocaust. Interestingly enough, despite these differences, the 2 experienced parallel beginnings in writing in general versus writing in a combination of poetry and prose. If This Is a Man was discovered by Saba, who found this subject interesting to him due to the discussion of Jewish identity in literature. In October 26th, he reached out, in 1948, he reached out to Levi's publisher. The work did not have many positive reviews at the time. Notably, Saba uses the word beautiful to describe it, and writes a first letter to Primo Levi on November 3rd, 1948.
Professor Zipoli argues that the letters are important for reinforcing the continued discussion in Italy of the genocide during the Holocaust and introducing the transformation of literature that followed at the time. They no longer lived in the same world as they had before, and their writing reflects a new form to encapsulate this new world in which they lived. At the time, Levi was very disappointed that few had read his work, knowing that he had something important that needed to be heard. Despite this challenge, it was evident through these letters, as Professor Zipoli points out, that he saw himself as a writer and knew what he had needed to be shared. These letters discuss the understanding and the concept of writing after the Holocaust. This new style of writing in content and in form displayed a new way of discussing the trauma of the war and the understanding of the world before, during, and after. According to Professor Zipoli, Levi and Saba have two different responses to the question, why write about the Holocaust, and were motivated in different ways. Additionally, the two approach writing in different ways, as Saba saw it as therapeutic, whereas for Levi, this was necessary to survive. They both used their personal experiences to describe universal ones and placed a large emphasis on memory and clearly explaining these stories to make sure the Holocaust was not forgotten. Professor Zipoli concludes the article by saying that the correspondence between Levi and Saba, although very limited in time, seems to be crucial in highlighting the similarities and differences in the poetics of these two authors. The epistolary exchange reveals that, in spite of their distance in age, geography, background, and experiences, the two authors are far more connected and far closer in their literary intentions than critics have reckoned this far. As a matter of fact, their poetics share some peculiar features, such as writing from the inside, writing built on one's own experience, the attempt to rationalize sorrow, and the need for clarity. Finally, the four letters also bear witness to the fact that, as Jewish writers and survivors of the Shoah, in their oeuvres, Saba and Levi anticipated the same literary issue of writing after and about the Holocaust, which later became the object of philosophical speculation and historical debate. So, Professor Zipoli, I was wondering what qualities or insights you think enabled Saba to foresee the importance of Levi's work, which both readers and publishers initially overlooked. Was this simply due to the similarities in the way the two authors perceived literature? How did Saba's unique perspective shape the way the book was later perceived? Additionally, do you think Levi and Saba were aware of the striking balance they achieved between literature as a form of art and its role as a historical narrative? Can you expand on how each author navigated the line between artistic expression and responsibility of historical testimony?
Thank you so much, Evangeline, for these questions. Not just a question. I wish we had time to go back and proofread again all the articles and include the students' insight. But first of all, I would like to start by thanking Roberta and Chiara for including my contribution in this collection of essays. I didn't get to participate in the symposium in honor of Nicholas Patruno that took place here at Bryn Mawr in 2022. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to still, be able to participate in this volume and give me the opportunity to study, to research on something that I hadn't been investigating before. And doing that in dialogue with the Nicholas Patruno's books, and to try to to combine my own research interests with the legacy, his legacy that this volume celebrates. And of course, thank you to the students for making this event possible from the very beginning in the organization, planning, and advertising also of this event. Going back to your questions, so I think it's very interesting, as you said, that Primo Levi's book, Se questo è un uomo, If This Is a Man, is now, a masterpiece of world literature, as Professor Ricci was saying, not just Italian literature, read, all over the world. but it was overlooked when it first came out. So it was, questo uomo was refused by Einaudi publishing house, so the most important publishing house in Italy, which was so important, especially in the post-war period. And Primo Levi was forced to publish it through a minor publisher and in a limited run of 2,500 copies. So really, I mean, it's really striking how a masterpiece, now considered a masterpiece, was not at that time. And it's even more interesting that just a few people noticed this volume in a limited edition, and Umberto Saba was among them. And Umberto Saba being a writer himself. And it's very interesting because just two people, really gave credit to the book when it came out, and those two people were Umberto Saba and Italo Calvino, so another major Italian author. So I think sometimes writers understand other literary works more than the public audience that Primo Levi wanted to address. So why? I mean, I like your question. Why did Saba resonate with this book? And it's interesting that he called it un libro fatale. Now, very difficult to translate it in English, fatale, like an inevitable book, that it needed to be written at that time. So it clearly resonated with it. And there is a beautiful quotation in one of the letters that he wanted to write to Primo Levi. By the way, the two authors never met, but we are privileged to have these beautiful letters that the two exchanged at a time in which, people used to exchange letters. And so we have testimony of that. So he says, and I will just read it in English in the interest of time. Saba says, many have described those horrors, so the horrors of the concentration camps, as Chiara was saying, but I have done so from the outside. No one whom I know of has done so from the inside. So it's very interesting because, as you said, Saba himself was a Jewish writer who underwent the fascist persecution against the Jews. He had to hide himself, and he had a horrible time during the persecution, but he did not experience the concentration camps. And so, to him, this book was a way to experience from the inside, as he says, something that was a threat for him, but that he did not experience. Grazie. And so it's very interesting how he was finding himself in an experience that he didn't live, but he could have lived. But on the other hand, it's also very interesting that Primo Levi replies because he takes the opportunity to read Saba's work, this marvelous book, Scorciatoie e Raccontini, Shortcuts and Short Stories, which is a book that has never been translated fully in English. So, and, maybe you should work on that. Maybe a thesis could be on that. Which, once again, is a book that has been overlooked by critics on Saba, but that Levi very much resonate with. Because, once again, he finds something about himself. So this need for understanding. So both for Primo Levi and for Saba, was not just a matter of recanting, of expressing their own experience of sorrow, of horrible experiences, but use writing to understand what happened, and to use their own sorrow, their own grief, as a way to as you said, as you pointed out, as a way to understand the universal grief, the universal sorrow. So even though they were so different, as you said, in age, background, literary intentions, but they shared some very important points in their poetics. And these letters, these 4 letters, really gave testimony of that. And it's interesting because it's a private conversation, but they share points that we can now include as literary critics in the discussion of Primo Levi's and Saba's works. So, for example, the point that you mentioned, what does it mean to write after the Holocaust? There is this famous phrase by Theodor Adorno that to write poetry after Auschwitz, after the horror of the concentration camps, is barbaric. So it's something that cannot be done. In a way, Saba and Levi asked the very same question before Adorno's famous stating, claiming for a role for poetry and literature, stating that it is not barbaric, it is fatale, it is inevitable, it is needed to try to use poetry and writing in order to understand what happened. And that's something that Levi praises in Saba's works, and I will just quote another phrase that I really struck me. By the way, it's a beautiful, and I was reading it again this morning, and I think it's just so beautiful. It says, Levi says, "This touched me less than your courage, your alert longing to have nothing unexplored. I prefer to bring up everything from the darkness of the underground to the light of awareness." So I think this is a very powerful way to describe the mission of literature and of poetry, which I think resonate to nowadays issues, as Professor Ricci was saying. So I think we may argue that one of the roles for literature is to leave nothing unexplored, to bring up everything from the darkness of the underground to the light of awareness. And I will just conclude with your question. Did Saba's review impact on the reception of Levi? So interestingly, it did not, because there was a private conversation. So no one read it apart from the two interlocutors. So Levi's output was recognized and acknowledged much later. But now that we can read Saba's words, I think it's very interesting to say what you suggested. So include Saba's point of view within our research, our understanding, quoting Nicholas Patruno's book of Primo Levi. So in other way, now we can read Primo Levi not only through the eyes of our critics, of our contemporary society, but also through the eyes of another great writer, who is Umberto Saba, who was among the few and very first intellectuals who gave credit to this work and found it valuable, not just as a piece of literature, but also for everyone, for even those who did not experience the concentration camps. I hope I replied to your question. Thank you.
Hi, I have the honor of presenting on Professor Ricci's article on Nicholas Patruno and his sort of philosophy and life's work on Levi. Her article is titled "Nicholas Patruno in Dialogue with Primo Levi, so that memory never fades." As you all may know, Nicholas Patruno dedicated much of his life's work to understanding Levi, a life's work that fundamentally changed our perspectives on Levi's work on the Holocaust. Specifically, Patruno's focus on the intersectionality of Levi added a new way to read Levi's works. Levi, as both writer and chemist, Italian and Jew, was important to Patruno. It was a reflection of Patruno's Italian-Jewish identity, as well as immigrant, first-generation college student at Rutgers, and later professor at Bryn Mawr College. So Ricci writes Patruno's focus on intersectionality. This intersectionality of an Italian Jew, interned in Poland, and later chemist who lent himself to literature, pervaded Patruno's courses dedicated to Levi and memory, which problematized the tenacious gap between art and reality, the literary landscape, and the logger experience, insisting on the role of imagination in the creation of literary characters and consequentially persuading the readers that caution is always in order. Because of Patruno's ability to see Levi's intersectionality, oftentimes as a reflection of his own life, he saw Levi's ability to intersect art and reality. It is this intersection that Levi creates the art of testimony in the plurality of disciplines, the want to remain truthful to historical record while using literary methods of fiction in his writing. Ricci also expands on Patruno's work of Levi in the classroom. Ricci also notes that it is important to examine Patruno's use of translation classes, translation as a way for students to engage with foreign literary works like Levi and apply to them to what they saw in their lives. To quote Ricci, the dialectual process of translating cultural gaps embodied avenues of communication as a unifying tool to tell stories and read across borders. Ultimately, translation courses were for Patruno a responsible model to embrace plurilingualism and intertextuality. Also in her article, Ricci focuses on Patruno's philosophy on translation, and translation courses stems from much of the influence of American culture had on Italy through the translation of American novels in the 1930s. Patruno was actually able to interview poet Eugenio Montale, which took place on May 6, 1976 in Milan, following the suggestions of Giorgio Ferrati, close friend of Ilo Vetturini. Ricci writes about this interview in Cultural Phenomenon, writing that translation became a linguistic and cultural phenomenon, thanks to which the reader experienced a sense of otherness, contamination, and yet communication. She concludes her essay with a reflection on the role of literature in carrying memory and testimony, both throughout time and across borders and languages. She finishes the essay with the quote, "In other words, ricordare, testimoniare, comunicare," so that memory never fades. So we have a couple of questions. In your article, you quote Levi's thoughts on communication, as he says, "One can and one must communicate. It is a useful and very easy way to contribute to the peace of others and to one's own, because silence, the absence of signals, is itself a signal, but an ambiguous one. And ambiguity generates anxiety and suspicion. Denying that you can communicate is false. You always can." Patruno, much like Levi, placed great emphasis on communication and translation as a form of resistance. Thanks to Patruno, translation courses are a staple of the transnational Italian department. Based on his legacy of using translation as a way to fight anti-Semitism, racism, or other forms of oppression, how do you approach teaching and designing translation courses in keeping with the motive of resistance and with the ideals of Levi and Patruno in mind? The next one is, in your view, is embracing plurilingualism and intertextuality in our discussions of literature enough to bridge cultural gaps and inspire both readers of Levi and now students in the transnational Italian department to engage with political activism in the real world? How do you see this manifest itself in your students, both in the engagements with the text and outside of class?
Emily, thank you so much for having read so carefully my article, and let me thank each of you for being here. This has been an amazing project. So Simona, thank you for trusting us with this project. So they are very complicated questions. Of course, I'll try to answer, reflecting on the journey which we all are following within academia and beyond academia. I think that if before elaborating some considerations on translation, let me reflect a little bit about what is literature, what literature was for Nicholas Patruno, what literature is for all of us, and what literature can be. And I believe a Marxist approach to literature can be very useful to help us realizing, and going back to what also Chiara was saying, that literature is action. Words are action. A famous literary critic, 20th century literary critic, Giacomo De Benedetti, was claiming that literature is communication, communication is dialogue, and through communication we can change things. We can express our disagreement, we can fight oppression, we can fight fascism, we can fight racial violence, gender violence, all sorts of discrimination. And this, I think, is particularly relevant not only in reading and rereading Primo Levi, but it's also to analyze the society and this revamping of nationalism and fascism and violence. So at this point, what is the connection between, literature and ethics, and literature and history? So I'm looking at my historian friend, so Madhavi, be generous with what I'm about to say. So if we, this has been a very debated question, what's the relationship between literature and history? And if we go back to antiquity with the Greek philosopher Aristotle, it was expressed in a very clear cut. History is science. History is describing facts, while literature elaborate on creating fictionalized characters. But then throughout the centuries, obviously, that clear cut vanished, and with Primo Levi, we know for certain that that clear cut is not true anymore. In fact, Primo Levi, in his writings dedicated to the Holocaust, speaks of the truthness of what he saw. I'm writing about history. Like Luca was saying, I have experienced horror. I was there. I know what Auschwitz is. And I'm writing because you need to know. So I'm writing history. Yet at the same time, there is a quote I'm really enjoying by Primo Levi. Said, a former deportee, a witness. I am that, even profoundly. But I do not want to be only this, which will mean in some ways a boxing in, an enclosure. I therefore hold myself free to touch whatever theme without excluding the return to this very theme of the lager, like in fact I have in mind to do. So there is that, and there is also something else. This helps us to contextualize what translation is. Translation studies, very dear to Patruno. We all know that translation is not an automatic operation from one language to another, right? The translation is much more than that. It's a recreation. And translation, like literature, it's a political tool. Translation helps us navigate with diversity, with otherness, with plurilingualism, with multilingualism, with multi-ethnicities. Translation is a way to navigate all of that. And in fact, in 1930s, and at the end of the volume, I published what I found in Nick's little office, that Edwina gave me the key and she said, this is all yours, have fun. You can take and read everything you find. I found a very interesting interview that Nick had with Eugenio Montale, one of the greatest 20th century Italian poet, who also was received the Nobel Prize. And that interview for me was interesting because Patruno doesn't interview Montale on his own poetry. Montale was already very famous, but he interviews Montale for his translation of American literature. And translation in the 1930s was again an anti-fascist tool, because during the fascism, foreign art, foreign films, foreign literature was censored, couldn't enter in Italy. So through translation, intellectuals of that time, Montale and Cesare Pavese and Elio Vittorini, brought to Italy American literatures according to a culture during a cultural phenomenon called Americanismo. So with translation, we can also express our resistance and nourish and embracing our anti-fascist culture. And to arrive to the last question, the last point about the activism, I see this activism every day in my students. So what happened when literature becomes history, but also when literature becomes activism, and I see every day new that, and I'm very inspired by that. The way that literature and words inspire us to be able to say and fight what is wrong. And just to give you an example, last Saturday we have an amazing conversation with an association against domestic violence in Italy via Zoom, and the students were not only engaged in this conversation, but really wanted to help to become more aware and to help spreading the awareness. Elisa, I'm looking about you, you know, you're working on that. So that's activism, and that's what the literature can help us do. And I think to conclude with what Nicholas Patruno was always saying, but also I think we all agree, and I hope also non-humanists agrees with us, that literature is not a too senseless way to spend our life. Grazie, Emily.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Lillian, and today I'm going to be presenting on Peter Kurtz's translation. I want to start with the fact that I study Italian, not French, so my French might be not so great in this presentation. Peter Kurtz translated François Rabelais by Primo Levi, and we just heard about the power of translation, so it's very timely, and I think we picked a good order for our presentation here. Kurtz's article is broken up into two parts. The first part lays out the influence of Rabelais in Levi's work, and also some notes and some choices that Kurtz made as a translator in remaining true to the author, and to also celebrate his work and bring it across national bounds, as per the Transnational Italian Department here at Bryn Mawr. Rabelais' Gargantua and Pantagruel was to Levi an example of a book which we carry with us over the years, for our whole lives, the reason why being clear, accessible, and simple to put into words. I thought that this quote was very profound because I think it also represented how many of us feel about Levi's work, especially after hearing from many of the other speakers, and it seems very interesting to see him speak about another author in this manner. He also wrote, "If you desire the world, it is enough to make it yours. Man is free and not predestined. He is faber sui, and he can and must triumph over the divine gift of earth. It is because of this that the world is beautiful and full of joy, not tomorrow but today, because the glorious delights of goodness and consciousness are open to everyone. To love humans is to love what they are, body and soul. Trip e boio."
And this is, again, very beautiful in showing Levi's appreciation of Rabelais and perhaps his influence in his later writing as he appreciates the humanity and the realness that Rabelais writes. We also note, Kurtz also notes the upside-down hero of Panurge, developed in this writing of Rabelais, who emerges as a representation of Rabelais himself, representing humanity, indecisiveness, love, humor, and sadness, all combined into one character, showing, again, that Levi believes in the power of trueness and the power of realness and the power of humanity. Kurtz writes, Rabelais speaks to us because we can see in this boundless painter of earthly delights and forceful and enduring acknowledgement, enriched by countless experiences, that the whole of life is not contained in this book. And the second half, before we get into the actual translation in Kurtz's article, talks about his choices as a translator. It was very interesting to read this article after taking a course in the Transnational Italian Department on translation and understanding how difficult it is to make these hard choices as a translator to remain true to the author, to the words, but also bringing it in a context that we, as English speakers, will understand. Kurtz writes, my aim was not to provide a necessary retranslation of Levi's essay into English, but rather to showcase Levi's affinity for Rabelais and to accentuate the great, if somewhat surprising, influence Rabelais had on Levi's own worldview and writing. He also touches on writings of Nancy Horowitz, who wrote also about Rabelais' influence on Levi in terms of combining modernity, history, and science all together in writing. He also writes that he did not look at the translation, Raymond Rosenthal's 1989 translation on this, until the very end of his work in order to remain true as his own translator to the text and his own bond that he was forming with Levi. He also chose he took a few liberties in translating, as translators must do, my favorite being the verb tacere, which in Italian is an active silence and is a verb that's very profound but doesn't really exist in the English language, and to decide whether to change that from a verb to a noun, as his silence is a choice that a translator has to make, and one that Kurtz did. And this leads me to my question. At the beginning of your translator's note, you offer a quote from Levi in which he describes himself as troppo chimico, e chimico per troppo tempo, per sentirmi un autentico uomo di lettere, troppo distratto dal paesaggio, variopinto, tragico e strano, per sentirmi chimico in ogni fibra. And we're wondering if you too felt pulled between the similar poles as you translated Levi's writing, in translation being as much an art as it is a science. And how did you navigate this balance in your work? And in this way or in any other, did you come to understand Levi as a writer and as a man in a new way?
Okay, thank you, Lillian, for that great question, for the introduction. And thank you, Roberta, Luca, Chiara, everyone for putting this together. It's very, very wonderful to be back. And thank you. I studied at Haverford College. I spent many hours in this basement in a class with Roberta, many classes with Roberta. So, yeah, it's just wonderful to be back, and thank you to the students in the modernism course for organizing this. So I really liked this quote when I found it. I really, especially that he's distratto dal paesaggio, was just like, for me, kind of like, I was like, this is fantastic. And I think what's interesting, part of what was really interesting about this writing by Levi is that he speaks in such a declarative way about Rabelais, in this way that like is almost as if he's sort of using him as a cipher to express something that is inherent to him. There's this essay by Patruno that I was reading just before coming here today, where for Levi, he has this argument that he doesn't always want to show exactly where his emotions are. And he sort of closely identifies this in some poetry. And I sort of, as I was translating this, was so, I guess, just surprised by the way in which Levi, I mean, on the one hand, it's very, like, to answer the second half of the question, it's unsurprising in a way that Rabelais is so profound for Levi, because he is, like, this worldly man. He is both writer and physician, right? for Levi writing about Rabelais, literature is a means to heal. He's both a writer, he's still a doctor even as he's a writer, Levi says. And so I think for Levi there is that balance sort of exists in this like almost mythological figure of Rabelais who becomes, and I'm also not like I'm not a Renaissance studies person. I also don't study French. I just like Rabelais. So I was like, I have to choose this essay. But it's interesting too, that in a lot of ways, it feels like Levi gets sort of carried away writing about Rabelais. Towards the end of that one quote, right, where he's talking about like triumphing over the divine gift of the earth. It's sort of shocking because that doesn't strike me as Levi in a way, right? I think he's very, very skeptical as a scientist of a myth of progress, and especially as someone who survived the Holocaust. I think that that's something that he's extremely skeptical of in his writings. So to sort of see this quote kind of pulled out is extremely shocking. And but I think for Levi, what it is it's a way for literature and science, for sort of those potentialities to like collide and multiply. So it's also, as I was translating it, it also got sort of hard for me not to get kind of carried away, just sort of in the voice of it. And as a translator, I think this is always a problem, is like, how much of this is my voice? How much of this is the author's voice? Where are we speaking? And where is this a dialogue? And I sort of, when I finally went to see the Rosenthal translation, how did he do it? It's very different than mine, and I think you can sort of see the Italian kind of poking through in it, which for me as a translator, I sort of do want it to stand on its own as a work, as something that can be approached and can be read and have its message pulled through. But to answer your question, there were certain points where there are things that are just absolutely impossible to translate, and you wind up learning about new things. For instance, he talks about the speech of the bosun as being kind of the spirit of Rabelais. And so I'm now looking, okay, what is a bosun? I've never seen this word before. And I'm going down into a JSTOR rabbit hole from 1930 because this is the only reference I'm able to find to this like Lombard popular poetry form. And that is just something that, okay, you cannot translate this. This is a footnote. Other points, when he writes about Panurge and he gets so invested in him, like he says, he is us, he is the uomo, he says he is the man. And I sort of was like, I think there's a more universal message to Rabelais in general, and I sort of went with human there. But, or I went with human there just because I sort of appreciate the sort of the panness, as it were, of Rabelais and the giantness of him. But even there, as you're sort of finding the rhythm of the language as it's moving from Italian into English, it gets sort of difficult not to take like a little bit of liberty. And you see that there's a new rhythm that's emerged in your translation from the original that you can capture and say, okay, this has to be here because this is just too. He's obsessed with this scene where Panurge emerges into the narrative and like famously is like begging for bread in every single language except French. And Levi just finds this hilarious. And I find it hilarious. So I as I was there, I had to sort of create this rhythm. I just sort of fell into place where it was like begging for bread in every language, living and dead. And I was like, maybe that's me, but like this has to be here because translation is very much, I think, a living practice and a dialogic practice. Levi has an interesting quote. This is the last thing I'll say because this touches on the problem of translation. In that essay he wrote, where he says that Gargantua and Pantagruel is frequently carved up to become children's literature, and its message is therefore like stultified, right? Canceled out by basically by censorship apparatuses. And it was not a book that was it was a book that was banned under fascism. It's long sort of has this legacy as like subversive literature because it's so right there and so clear. And I think what translating and what continuing to translate into even a work that has been published and the extant translation is quite good. What I think the practice of continuing to translate even things that are the reason why we need new translations is because we just sort of continue need to have that dialogue across languages and to sort of engage with like minor texts. For me, again, this, and that's the last thing I'll say. For me, this is, I don't really know how much this changed my perception of Levi, but in a way, I mean, you know, it is sort of profound to see him like sending up Joyce and Sterne in this essay, and you sort of do get this sense of Levi basically not just as a scientist, not just as a lettered man, but also sort of to what you were saying before, Chiara, that he's also, I think, wants to position himself as like an extremely like well-read person, kind of like in this vein of like, you know, the multilingual, like explosive writers. And for a writer, for me, who exists so much in his silences and in his understatements and in his like minor vignettes, right? It is really profound to sort of see that, like, you know, Il Sistema Periodico is also a tapestry, right? And it's a lot of minor stories that come together to create something whole and beautiful. And I think his project is closer to Gargantua and Pantagruel than I think I would originally have considered. So yeah, that was sort of my big takeaway, I guess. Yeah.
Hi. So as kind of our last article and our last guest here today, Scott Lerner has written this article, which is actually not in this edited volume, but I think has a lot to say about memory and history and dialogue with these other articles that we've heard about, called Primo Levi nel contesto dell'ebraismo italiano, lo specchio dello Stato nazionale dal risorgimento al fascismo, or Primo Levi in the context of Italian Judaism, the reflection of the national state from risorgimento to fascism. So Lerner opens his article as Primo Levi opens Il Sistema Periodico, talking about the chapter Argon, in which Levi writes about a generation of 19th century Jews in Piedmont, in the north of Italy, that similar to his own ancestors, and they're characterized primarily. Lerner focuses on their dialect that's specifically used, but kind of start out this representation of Jewish figures in this work, and these three themes that continue throughout the rest of Il Sistema Periodico, this kind of reciprocal indifference towards Christians or Catholics and this divide or barrier between them, an idea of like a Jewish passivity, and most importantly, this, what Lerner describes as a dimenticanza di una importante realtà storica recente, that is forgetting an important recent historical reality. So Lerner traces these three themes through other sections of the periodic table to reveal this kind of hidden past that lies beneath the surface of the work, creating a parallel between the liberal period that is from 1861 to 1921, prior to the fascist period in Italy. And so Lerner describes this kind of disconnect between the anti-fascist intellectuals during the 20th century and the kind of previous wave of intellectual resistance and kind of work to create a more equal society that took place during, before, and after the Italian unification, stating that these are notably absent from direct reference in the periodic table, although people like Giacomo Dina or Raffaello Lambruschini, as Lerner describes, dovevano ideare uno Stato che proteggesse le piene libertà per gli ebrei in seno a una società di maggioranza cattolica. That is, that these Italian thinkers had to try and create a state that would protect full rights for Jewish people within a majority Catholic society. But there's a lack of direct reference to this specific history in Levi's text. And Lerner asks why this is and returns to the image of the tarlo, or the woodworm, which is one that comes up both in Argon at the beginning of the periodic table and in a later story. This kind of creature that is found within elements of the past, and uses this to talk about how This past is not necessarily erased or deliberately absent, but is perhaps waiting to be organized, and reflects on the complexity of memory and history in Levi and the dual nature of these two, to kind of conclude that Levi has kind of a very complex relationship with this pre-fascist Italian history, and that allows him to reflect on memory and history, which are obviously, as we know, very important themes throughout all of Levi's works. And so I have two questions, one about your article and one kind of tying together this with the edited volume. At the end of your article, you conclude that the image of the woodworm and Levi's treatment of the historical context is a doubled image, complex as history and elusive as memory. The periodic table is also a complex mix of styles, a foray into testimony mixed with imaginative work, as opposed to simply testimony-based writings of Levi, such as If This Is a Man. I was wondering if you could elaborate more on how this form and content interact in the periodic table, and how this overall ambiguity between history and memory, or between testimony and imagination, affect the work. And then a second question, how do you see this book, Primo Levi, Essays and Dialogue with Nicholas Patruno, fit into the larger panorama of academic work on Levi?
Thank you for those. Is this on?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much for those questions and for summarizing the article. And also, I want to say how happy I am to be here. I don't live very far away. I teach at Franklyn and Marshall, but I have some great long-term friends in the audience and on the panel, and also, in particular, I'm really here as a gesture of gratitude, I would say, to Professor Patruno. I didn't know him well. I got to know him at the beginning of my career, and I was impressed, I think, like many of you who knew him, by his generosity. And I was also very struck by by something that Roberta wrote when he died a few years ago. In fact, I'd actually like to just quote it. You say that with humility and gratitude, we will try to follow your ethical example. And I was struck by that, and this idea of trying to create an ethical community around a scholar and a friend like Patruno, and how you come up with a volume that reflects that, how you write about Primo Levi and Nick's legacy as a scholar in dialogue with that. So I think it's a wonderful project. I think it's an extremely impressive volume. I've read most of it, not quite all of it. I haven't yet read about Rabelais, but that's what I'll do as soon as I get home tonight. And I hope the rest of you will read the book too, because it really is it's really worth it. So thank you, Lucy, for those questions. My article begins from, I think, a perspective that we've heard a lot about today already, and that is really the question of what it means, as Roberta said in her essay, to be for literature to be historically grounded. What does it mean for someone like Primo Levi, who first became known as a witness, and became known for the idea of bearing witness and for this chain of witness, and then, but was also did so as a brilliant writer. It wasn't immediately recognized as such, we know, but really was, and became an ever stronger writer. What does it mean for that kind of an individual to be both grounded in history, but not imprisoned by history, and not imprisoned by certain ways of situating something even as complex as the Holocaust in a particular history? And I guess I'll just say in reference to my own article, I don't want to say too much about it, it's not part of this volume, but it does begin with similar questions. The question that I asked was, how in the world could Primo Levi make such a mess of history in the periodic table? And I tremble saying something like that in such an erudite setting. But I had just come out, John Drucker, who's also a contributor to this volume, and I had just edited a volume called, that was all about the New Italy and the Jews, and its subtitle was From Massimo d'Azeglio to Primo Levi. And so I was really thinking about this legacy of the birth of the Italian state and liberalism and the role that a small Jewish minority had played at the beginning of the ideation of modern Italy, and how important it had been, in the same way I think it was in France, to for the nation to have to come to terms with what it meant to have a Jewish minority in what was then almost exclusively a Catholic society. And also, with this long, centuries-long legacy of Catholicism and the idea of a Christian society and a Catholic society that had been perpetuated in many ways. And so when liberalism arose, it had to deal with what we might term, maybe it's not the best way, but what we might term the Jewish question. It was inevitable. It couldn't have been avoided. What do you do with the Jews? What does it mean to create a truly free society, a new society in the context of Italy? It was inevitable to think through questions of equality vis-a-vis the majority that existed in that country, that had for centuries, and that was the Jewish majority. And so I was expecting, in a way, or one would have, I think, expected to see some kind of an acknowledgement of the history of the Jews within the sort of Italian national story. And not only the history of the Jews as a community, but the individuals who took part in the national history, who had been very important. And Levi begins the periodic table with an essay, first of all the gases to choose to describe his Jewish origins, he chooses argon and describes and talks about how it's an inert gas from the very beginning. And the essay has often been read as a kind of mini history of Piedmontese Jewry, but it's really nothing like that at all. It doesn't acknowledge the active and not inert contributions of that community to the Italian national story, particularly in the liberal period. And I wouldn't even say so much in the liberal period, but in almost the pre-liberal period, in 1947, 48, when the ideas were percolating and they hadn't had a chance to betray those ideals in practice, which is, I think, largely what happened in the liberal period. He doesn't deal with any of that, but he deals intensely with fascist history. Not necessarily directly, but it's there, it's very present and it's acknowledged. And of course he deals with the history of the Holocaust. And so I was so struck by this, and I tried to come to terms with that. I knew that he was far too well-informed and smart and wily in a way to not be aware of what he was doing. I was convinced he was doing this intentionally. And so it really raises the whole question of what it means to, perhaps what's the difference between bearing witness and reconstructing history, or writing history, or playing the role of a historian. I think certainly in the periodic table he very much refuses that, and finds many, many other ways of expressing the kinds of things that he's interested in without any attempt to fix history, even in a chronology. And I was really struck by that, and that's what the essay is a meditation on. And I think that is really what is at the core of this volume as well. And so it's a happy coincidence. And I was thinking when I read those essays that I had a chance to read about my own encounter with Nick Patruno. And I have to say, I met Nick right after he had published Understanding Primo Levi. And that was a time when Levi had already become part of the canon in Europe and Italy. He was no longer, I won't say simply, but he was no longer only survivor witness and memoirist. He was a very much respected member of the literary canon, and he rubbed shoulders with Calvino and others, and people understood that. And there were certain people who understood that in America as well, but they tended to be some of the great Jewish American writers. So he was in part discovered by and appreciated and promoted by Saul Bellow and Philip Roth. And so in America at that point, he had already become, in a way, assimilated as more of a Jewish writer than he was in Europe. He was already in Europe more of a writer, sort of tout court, right? And so when Nick Patruno devoted a whole volume to Levi with such passion and such commitment as a reader, and developed a profoundly empathetic relationship to Levi's writing, as Penny Marcus describes so beautifully in the volume. Even at one point, bursting into tears. Penny Marcus, who was teaching at Penn at the time, I guess she saw him come out of class when they were doing their summer program in Florence together, and he had burst into tears in the classroom. He had become so empathetically engaged with the text and with the students before him that he just became very emotional. To have that, I mean, and I think that's a beautiful metaphor for his whole project with Levi, which is to say, as far as I know, and I'm sure that his wife could correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, Nick didn't have a personal attachment to the Holocaust. Not that one needs to, of course, but many people did at the time who were interested in Primo Levi, and he didn't. And so it wasn't because there was a family legacy. The port of entry, so what was the port of entry? What attracted Primo Levi to Nick Patruno? It had to be his ability to be such an extraordinary respondent to the call of Levi to bear witness, right? That is really the central to C'est quoi sur moi, right? This idea of the Shema, and how we are all called to become part of what John Drucker calls in his essay, what does he call it? Well, he refers to the shame of the just. That's to say that all of us, even if we are not culpable, still are called upon to feel ashamed when in the face of certain kinds of atrocities, in this case the Holocaust. And I think that's a very, I think this volume is successful because it responds to that call, and it remains faithful to this idea of, rather than imprisoning Primo Levi in a particular history, even though he can be historically grounded, it opens up the perspectives, as Roberta said at the beginning. And it does so in so many different ways. Each essay does so in a different way. Chiara talked about her essay, and I was going to say something about it, but it's already been discussed so thoroughly by some very thoughtful students and thoughtful respondents. And Luca as well. This whole question of art and how you write differently after Auschwitz, and one almost feels sorry for Theodor Adorno after that essay, right? Because it sounds so ridiculous to say that poetry is dead. And I guess I want to go on. I'm aware of the hour, but I just want to say that there's one more essay that we haven't talked about here, and that's by my friend and colleague John Drucker, whom I mentioned earlier. And his essay is really about extracting an ethics out of Primo Levi's work. And it's in part it's a very sophisticated essay. I really hope you'll all read it. This idea of the shame of the just, it's not his idea, but he really pulls it, he teases it out very deftly. But what I really like about it is the very idea that I think this volume as a whole expresses so well, that it's appropriate to universalize history, or a certain kind of experience, to resist certain kinds of entrappings, how we can become vulnerable to claiming a certain history for ourselves. I think it's something that, actually I think I'm going to just read a few sentences that I wrote to make it, because I want to choose my words carefully. We sometimes see an unfortunate tendency. I was just I'm talking about the empathetic reader and the empathetic human being, and how that is the subject position, the perspective that Nick Patruno brought to Levi. And I say that we sometimes see an unfortunate tendency to do just the opposite, to lay claim to the Holocaust in history, to the status of victim, to the injunction that never again can it be revisited on its victims and their descendants, as a means of rationalizing an unwillingness or an inability to see the suffering and injustices of our own day and to respond with deep empathy. In 1982, Primo Levi took action himself. He answered his own call during the war in Lebanon of that year. That was the year that was followed by the massacres in Sabra and Shatia. The students here find this to be ancient history, but I remember it very well. And he and Edith Brooke, pounded the pavement and signed petitions and wrote articles in the newspaper. And he said that he didn't recognize in that war, and in a sense, in a certain role or identity of the state of Israel, the same hope, the same image that he had represented so often in his own work, and that he saw it in terms of a war, more of aggression than of defense. And so I think that without telling us how to act, without telling us what to do, this volume in many ways is very faithful to the spirit of Primo Levi, who both is a witness to history, but also is a very reluctant fellow traveler. And an event like this, in which we don't reduce these questions to sound bites, but really try to tease them out in an intergenerational way, I think is just wonderful. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Scott, for this the first review of the book. The book just came out, and we got the first positive review of it. So thank you so much for your words and for being here. We are also very happy to have you here, and of course. Scott has written on Primo Levi and has been teaching on Primo Levi, so your words really resonate with us, and we are very grateful for that. And thank you all again for being here. We would like at this point to open the floor to questions. Yes.
Scott anticipated the question.
Okay, aspetta, Nicola.
Thank you to you all. I am a dear friend of Nick Patruno. For me, still next to my side. Scott already anticipated my question. Nick and I had many conversations about why Primo Levi, and we share a common sense of guilt. We are both Italian, Nick and I, and we came from an Italy which was fascist. I think the fascination and the attachment that Nick had for Primo Levi was a sense of bring history back. Everybody, as Scott mentioned, that guilty are not just those who committed that, but also the atrocity, but also those who forget about it. So there's the sense of responsibility we carry. When Nick discussed at length about the fact that we were also Italian when Mussolini took the power, and so on. I do remember 1998, when with Penny Marcus at Penn, we organized a conference on the movie that came out at the same time, La vita è bella by Benigni e La tregua by Umberto by Francesco Rosi. And Nick was called to be part of the academic discussion to represent history, and it was there are two moments in the film. If I don't spoil anything about it, but in La Vita è Bella, Benigni made Auschwitz freed by the Americans when he stayed with the Russians who that. And in La Tregua, there was a very famous moment when Primo Levi reached the station, and the German soldier, the Nazi, the German, kneel in front of him. So which kind of the invention that the freedom of the director made. And Nick was so upset to represent the historical part because he loved both those very important testimony of the film that, well, I'm called to say the history is different from what has been represented, but I really love because the sense of testimony, as Scott mentioned to it before, is so important. This dialogue between Primo Levi and Nick was very constant. One of the best friends of Nick here at Bryn Mawr was the rabbi. And even though, as Scott mentioned, was not this sense of living the Holocaust or living the Jewish experience, was intrinsic to him, was intrinsic to myself, that we had come from a country which 1930 promulgated such horrible law. And so when I thank you for this testimony towards Nick, which is all very close to my heart. And the last mention to Roberta, thank you for organizing all of this. And your sense is so important. I would say that close to literature or together with literature is also cinema. Not because I do that at Penn, but it's also cinema that is testimony. I always say to my student, you don't live to have the experience. Literature and cinema, I already said that. And literature cinema is such an incredible tool for you to learn and to bring to reality what just happened. So thank you to you all. Thank you upstairs. I'm sure that is there, looking at us with his beautiful eyes and laughing and said, yes, I was right again. Sorry for that. Thank you.
Grazie, Nicola.
I'll hold it for now when anyone has another question.
Any other questions or comments? So, yeah, also from the panelists. And it was, Simone, and it was 2022. Yeah, just to be a few months after the symposium. I remember Simona, Chiara, and I had an aperitivo in my house, and Chiara had this idea to move the symposium into a book, and we invited Simona, who immediately shared her support. So we are very grateful for that, and to all of you for having participated to the book, to this panel, and to the conversation, which I hope will continue beyond today's event. But before concluding, if there aren't any more questions, we have another special surprise. This morning I received an email. Edwin, I'm sure you remember Alani, our alumna who graduated, I think it was 2008. an Italian triple major, Spanish, French, and Italian, who received a couple of masters, a couple of PhDs, and now she's our colleague, Brown. Like Peter soon will be our colleague. Peter also is a Haverford major in complete. So Alani was sorry not to be able to be here, and she has sent 2 poems that she wrote, and with which we would like to conclude our event.
So this first poem is called Pace e Riorientamento by Alani Hicks Bartlett. And the epigraph: Per te piange un fanciullo in un giardino, o forse in una favola. Umberto Saba, da Variazioni sulla rosa. Abbiamo pregato le montagne per le fibre della tua voce, per il bagliore di luce che lampeggiante illumina le rocce e il deserto dalla scintilla sempre accesa negli occhi tuoi. Vi è una breve pace? Esiste una breve pace? Abbiamo gridato e chiesto a gran voce la tua saggezza, il tuo acume, umorismo e la tua profonda comprensione. Abbiamo bramato e anelato per le tue pagine intramontabili, per l'immensa distesa delle tue parole, per la valle sbiancata qui, depurata dei suoi colori ardenti e focosi, ma ora calma, tranquilla, morbidamente rossa e rosa, delicatamente arancione sotto il sole crepuscolare che declina ancora e ancora. Avevamo fame e abbiamo sentito il desiderio pressante, comune e condiviso, solidale e fraterno, familiare e familiare, di ascoltare o di leggere di nuovo il tuo forte messaggio, di leggere di nuovo il tuo messaggio confortante, di nuovo di vedere quella valle sbiancata da questa parte e il boschetto lussureggiante laggiù, i cipressi, i cedri, le querce. Esiste una breve pace, caro amico, o ci resta solo il ricordo indelibile del nostro bardo e la solitudine come un mantello a cui ci aggrappiamo, disorientati e danteschi e disorientati.
The second poem is called On Resurgence in Poesie, and the epigraph reads, E quindi uscimo a rivedere le stelle. To you, for whom every season was a start, for whom every decadence was a spark, for whom every obstacle was an idea, for whom the sorrowing cities still brought some comfort through their inevitable resistance, through the daydream of opportunity and better fortunes, community and better wares. Consider this, you said, smiling, comforting, reassuring like the marble balustrades that protect us, reassuring like the warmer homes that block the gelid night, reassuring like the wise guide, comforting, and heartening like the leader, always and ever the leader, remaining true to honest desires and the song set in your ear. Confident in the promise of sun after the proverbial storm, in the promise of reemergence after the long infernal descent, eyes like a lighthouse in the darkness, like a lighthouse in the long darkness, perspicacious across the yellowed pages, across the yellowed years. Eyes gentle and committed, the true real north, the true real pupils, never dimmed, not dimmable, and always yours. Le sole vere pupille, non mai offuscate, e sempre tue. E qui la morta poesia resurga, regenerates, emerges again and again.
And with this, we conclude our round table. So thank you again, everybody, for being here. Thank you to the panelists. And thank you, a special thank you to the students. Woo-hoo!